Okay, so welcome back. Now we're covering chapter 1, titled Racialization and Language. Now, I've assigned this to students. I've been assigned this in 3 separate classes, as I mentioned. But like I said, even at the PhD level, sometimes questions sound like, what is race? What is ethnicity? Now, these questions assume that it is possible to define what race and ethnicity are, as if there was this definitional list of like factors that you have to check off, and then you get one or the other. Like, oh, this culture is unique enough in combination with skin color, in combination with this particular bloodline or genealogy or ancestry, with origins from this specific country, speaking this specific language. This must be ethnicity, or this must be race. Now, with Urciuoli's theory, concepts like race and ethnicity change meaning and shift around in context. So there's no master list of factors. They're signs that are assembled together with a history that is part of and brought into every context. Not only that, people have very different perceptions of what history is. In some places, race has a lot to do with religion. For example, a Jewish person. Is a Jewish person a white person? Depends on the context. How about a Muslim in America? Is that race or is that religion? Right? So very tricky. But right away, I would advise that we stay away from these either or type answers, because that is our first hint that we're not asking the right questions. Especially when it comes to ethnicization discourse, which we'll see in this video, because that one is particularly tricky too. So in Urciuoli's work, we get a focus on the effects of particular kinds of talking and conversations that end up characterizing people as either something like a race or something like ethnicity. These discourses, keyword discourses, or conversations, both written and spoken, these discourses stabilize our perception of some groups, which will likely have effects that exacerbate inequalities and discrimination. Now, according to Urciuoli, or at least what she focuses on here, are two very powerful kinds of conversations. Racialization discourse, which has the effect of racializing, or ethnicization discourse, and ethnicization discourse, which have the effect of making a group into an ethnicity, or EthnoSizing. So let's look at racialization first. Racializing a group have these conversations that racialize groups have very common elements that sound the same, such as characterizing a group or a person as dirty or dangerous or inferior in various ways, specifically in regards to morality, like sexual practice or family values or the way education is valued or not, etc. But inferior is a comparison. Inferior to who is a good question. And that's also what's really interesting here. This brings us to the marked, unmarked distinction, or the marked, unmarked idea. We can't easily see who we're comparing racialized groups to, because the group that we're comparing them to is unmarked. This unmarkedness is seen as normal. Now, who is this unmarked group? It is probably a very idealized American whiteness, An American whiteness that is hardworking, probably Christian, definitely heterosexual. This is the unmarked ground that we all walk on, that we all live on. And we don't generally talk about this stuff. Or at least we imagine ourselves as not talking about this stuff. And it's hard to see these unmarked elements because it's part of growing up in America. We don't perceive what we consider normal because it's exactly that, normal. But we'll see the abnormal much easier. We'll see the deviation much easier. So this is what we're thinking of when we think of marked and unmarked. Normal, not normal. Now, certain signs, certain assemblages of signs are marked as deviating from this normal. Or the unmarked ground that we walk on is suddenly surprised by this marked phenomenon. But some people know that they don't share that ground, so it's much easier for some people to see that. For example, a black American will more than likely become conscious of their blackness in elementary school or kindergarten or even pre-K. A white person, being the normal, being the unmarked, may never need to talk about their whiteness until college, or sometimes later, or sometimes never. That is the privilege of being considered normal. Okay, so now let's move on to ethnicization discourse. So, EthnoSizing a group. So this one's a little different because a group is seen as achieving a certain degree of legitimacy in American society. So this group or person has done things the right way. And by the right way, I mean in most cases the unmarked way, the normal way, which is code for white American values. So these particular groups that are seen through or that are perceived through an ethnicizing discourse will be seen as contributing citizens to American society. So their culture might be seen as colorful or having a rich tradition or having strong family values, which it's not coincidental that these moral views about hard work and family also align with the bootstrap white American or Christian values when it comes to family and morality. So in general, ethnicity is seen as something good for American society. And again, American society, meaning specifically the ideal unmarked white American version of American society. So let's clarify something that I think a lot of people get caught up on or are tricked by or something. Urciuoli warns us in the very, very first paragraph that all ethnicities were at some point a race. So let's immediately stop here and think about that question. Is so-and-so a race, or is so-and-so an ethnicity? It's much better to acknowledge that any group can be considered both. It just depends on if it becomes politically advantageous for someone to talk about someone else in a particular way. In this case, in a racializing way or in an ethnicizing way. So that's a little abstract. So what do I mean by this? So let's go through a kind of simple but never simple example. So let's think about a commonly racialized group, the idealized Black American community. that allegedly all share the same values and exist as a giant blob of dangerousness. However, something covered by the mainstream media in the US are celebrations like Martin Luther King parades. Now, MLK parades are perceived as highly beneficial to most parts of white American society. So it's a celebration of equal rights and anti-discrimination, etc., etc. All this good stuff aligns with the ideal version of American society. So this is an ethnicizing discourse. Or is it? Is it only an ethnicizing discourse or only a racializing discourse? That's, again, one of those questions, one of these either or questions that we might want to stay away from. MLK parades were not always seen as beneficial to society. Perhaps years ago, or even in contemporary parts of white America, MLK parades are mediated through straight-on racializing discourses, straight-on racist speech. I guess today, however, in more polite conversation, maybe it more often sounds like ethnicizing discourse, right? So something good for society, good for white American society. So which is it? Ethnicizing, racializing? This, to me, is a less important question. This deciding whether it's definitively this or definitively that. Because remember, Urciuoli says in the very first paragraphs, ethnicities were always seen as race first. And because we're taking a semiotic approach, we can't disconnect history from what we happen to be perceiving at a particular moment in time. So I personally see nothing wrong with saying MLK parades is a conversation that has elements from both racializing discourses and ethnicizing discourses. Which brings me to the next point, ethnicizing discourse. Now, even though it looks positive, it looks like a good thing, right, for certain ethnicities to be accepted into the mainstream American idea of America. It also has detrimental effects on certain marked populations. For example, people associate Martin Luther King with this moment in time where there was like only peaceful demonstrations and only peaceful protests, right? The ethnicizing discourses that celebrate MLK and the civil rights movement erases the violence and even the assassination of MLK. So ethnicizing discourses make the civil rights movement seem like this, great American progress, and not this reaction, this violent reaction to American oppression. This is one effect of ethnicizing discourse. While it may look less bad or might immediately feel less bad, the damage is being done on some different scale. It's reinforcing inequalities up and down the social class spectrum. It just might work at a different scale as opposed to a face-to-face conversation where you perceive something as racist or not. So even ethnicizing discourses, even though they elevate certain groups in very particular ways, those ways have to be aligned with white American values. So this does not lessen racism in America. It preserves it. It expands it. It intensifies it. It legitimizes it. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope I gave you a running start into your reading. If you weren't assigned the introduction to this book, I highly suggest you read it. Yes, get it and read it, or at least watch the first video in this series. It's important. You don't need to be an expert in semiotics, but it will at least get you thinking about how flexible and underdetermined these kinds of discourses can be. Okay, so that's it. This is Mike signing off. I'll see you next time.